Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. This is Marta's Sci-Fi Seminar, and this is our third video on drafting your first novel. And we're here to celebrate that if all has gone well, you're at about 10,000 words. It's pretty fantastic. Give yourself a hand. My hope is that with the materials you've been developing, outlining, brainstorming, you're starting to feel like you have things to come back to. You have some footholds now. And my hope is that you are continuing to be able to track chapters and scenes. Things are starting to feel like you've got some traction and some momentum. If you're aiming for a novel of 60 to 70,000 words, and that's about where we're headed, given the way I've got these videos set up, then you are about 15% of the way there. So very much worth celebrating. Keep going, keep up that momentum. My little bit of advice this week builds on some of what I talked about last time, that even as you work in genre and sort of fill out those obligations of the genre, you are also changing and shaping the genre just by your presence and your contribution to it. It's a lot of power, it's a lot of freedom. And if you're a sci-fi fan, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So we're going to talk a little bit about that this week, particularly as it regards character creation. Particularly if you are a white writer, then it's very important to think about, as you create characters who are racially different from yourself, being sensitive about creating those characters as fully fledged people, not as stereotypes. That may take some homework. And you know, I'm not shy about that. I continue to encourage you all to read writers of color. I want you to continue to think about issues of race and difference. And my hope is that that will show up in your writing in a compassionate way. Similarly, if you are a straight writer creating gay characters, if you are a cis writer creating characters who are transgender. Some of you may not be entirely sure what that term cis means. Cis means that the gender that you were assigned at birth is still a gender that suits you. It's still a gender that fits. And anyone who is not cis then would be trans or non-binary or gender fluid. There can be a number of things that folks who are not cis understand themselves to be. But being cis means that gender assigned at birth continues to fit and continues to work. Folks who are not cis, either that gender has never ever fit, or at some point they come to understand that that gender is not a good fit. So being sensitive in your creation of characters who are different from yourself racially, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of gender, is a really important part of creating a book that creates a representation of the world in which we live. Now, as science fiction writers, you may not be doing what we call mimetic fiction. You may not be attempting to recreate the world as we know it. You may be creating a world that is radically other in all of those ways, and in many, many other ways as well. That's okay, but that need to be thoughtful in your creation of characters different from yourself still holds. We've got a lot of terrific examples in classic science fiction of aliens who are incredibly thought-provoking, that let us see our prejudices, that let us see the limitations of our human point of view in incredible ways. We've also got a lot of aliens in classic science fiction that are just stand-ins for racial stereotypes, and it's not okay. So please be thinking, even as you create aliens, even as you create alien worlds, how that's going to reflect the world that you live in, the world that all those things, however imaginative and wonderful, are bubbling out of. My favorite aliens, just as an aside, if you want to read a writer who does aliens really well, Octavia Butler is one of my absolute favorites. I recommended Bloodchild, her book of short stories, in my very first video, and I would say the Oncali, who are part of her Xenogenesis series, which is sometimes sold as the 3 individual novels, sometimes sold as an omnibus. If you're seeing the individual novels, then the first one of them is Dawn. If you're seeing the omnibus, then what you're looking for is Lilith's Brood. But as you think about creating alien characters, Octavia Butler is a fantastic model for the amount of thought, the amount of work that has clearly gone into her evocation of people who are entirely other, and yet still somehow able to connect and converse with human beings. So that's pretty fabulous. But again, the bottom line here, folks, is do your homework. If you're writing characters different from yourself, know something about those characters. Know something about the culture that those characters are coming from. Know something about the motivations that move those characters. Do your homework. I've encouraged you before to read writers different from yourself, read writers of color, read writers who are gay or who are trans, read writers with disabilities. I am still doing homework. That's been a harder facet of writerly identity to pin down, but I will have some more things to say about writers with disabilities, more recommendations there for you as we progress. But the key here, folks, is sensitivity, empathy, kindness, and homework. Lots of homework. Representation is good. We want people to be able to see a little of themselves in our books, but centering yourself in the guise of someone else that you don't really understand gets really problematic, particularly if you are a white, straight, cis writer. So some thoughts on that if you are creating, particularly if you are creating aliens for your next book. Think about how that's going to be perceived by your audience. All right, in terms of recommendations, N.K. Jemisin's Far Sector. I said at some point I was going to talk about comics. This will probably not be the only time I mention comics. I hope it's not the only time I mention comics. But I am particularly, this is forefront of my attention right now because this is the last week or so has seen the end of the Far Sector limited run that N.K. Jemisin as writer, Jamal Campbell as illustrator have created for DC's Young Animal. And Lantern Mullen is hands down my favorite Green Lantern, and quite possibly my favorite superhero at this point. The 12 issue, and there may be more, we don't know, as far as I could find out, we don't know if there will be more Far Sector. But the 12 issues track the progress of Lantern Sojourner Mullen as she goes out as a Green Lantern, further out than any Green Lantern has gone, to act as sheriff for the city everlasting. And it's a city of billions of people. One race of folks from the city everlasting is a race of search engines. One are the K-Topley, who are sentient, mobile plants, carnivorous plants. And the other are the, I'm not going to remember the name, who are winged, who have wings and tails, very bat-like in appearance. And these three races who understand themselves as the trilogy have coexisted because of some particular compromises. And the series Far Sector starts with the breakdown of some of those compromises, and Lantern Mullen is called in to help manage the situation. It's wonderfully written. It's beautifully illustrated. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. So I highly recommend Far Sector. If you're new to comic books, one of the neat things is, because this happens so far out of everything else, that you don't have to know all of everybody's connections to everybody else. I've heard several people the last few years complain that they can't get started on an individual comic book because those stories are so enmeshed in all the other stories happening in DC or in Marvel. This is a story that's really self-contained because it's happening so far out. So those are my recommendations. Read Octavia Butler. Learn from watching her how to create aliens, how to be thoughtful and sensitive in your creation of alien races. Read N.K. Jemisin's Far Sector, because it is a fantastic example of science fiction, of political science fiction, of comic book adventure. It's wonderful, it's fun, and you don't have to know everything about all the other Green Lanterns or all of the other DC superheroes to enjoy it. So, I will see you next time. Until then, keep reading, keep writing. Bye-bye!